Now we're going to look at two more seam finishes. The first one we're going to look at is stitched and pinked. This is a good choice for fabrics that ravel very little. It's a good choice for fabrics that need to be dry cleaned, but it's not desirable for sheer fabrics where it would show through the fabric. The first thing you want to do is, once again, start with your seam sewed at 5/8 and then press it open, and on each side you would do a line of stitching 1/4 of an inch from the edge of your seam allowance. And remember, once again, you're just going through the seam allowance. Then you would take a pair of pinking shears and you would cut along the edge of the seam allowance with your pinking shears. You would like to take nice smooth stitches, and you would continue up on both sides of your seam until both seams were pinked. And remember, you're just doing the seam allowances and both edges are pinked. Then the next seam allowance that we're going to look at is a bound seam allowance, and there are two methods. Once again, for both of them, you would start with a seam of 5/8 of an inch and press it open. Then you need a piece of bias tape, and bias tape comes pre-packaged. I'm using single fold. There is wider bias tape, so you need a piece the length of your seam. And then what you need to do is, it's a good idea to press it in half, and you would take your seam allowance and wrap your bias tape around your seam allowance and pin it down. So you wrap it around and pin it down like this. This is pinned down, and then you would stitch it down. And you want to make sure that you catch the front side and the back side. When you're finished, it would be finished like method 1, right here. It's stitched on both sides, it's stitched down. There's a second method that you can use, and you would take your piece of bias tape and you would press it open on one side, and one of the sides is a little bit narrower. That's the one you want to press down. And you would take your seam allowance and pin your bias tape to your seam allowance, right along the edge of your seam allowance, like so. And then you would do a line of stitching just next to the folded edge. Then, when you've pinned it and stitched it, it's all stitched down like so, then you want to press it over all the way down and wrap it around the edge of your seam allowance, okay, like so. One little hint is, sometimes I find it helpful to just trim off the tiniest little sliver of that seam allowance to make sure that it goes around and covers. And then what you do is you pin it and you turn it around and you stitch in the ditch. That is right next to your binding, not on your binding this time. When you do that, you want to make sure that you're catching the back. Method 2, and you can see right here, I've used contrasting thread so that you can see that I've stitched right down along the edge. The stitching wouldn't show as much if you used matching thread to your fabric and bias, but you want to make sure that it catches on the other side too. So those are two methods of finishing seams, pinked and stitched and bound. And I've given you those two methods, but I haven't asked you to do them for an assignment because they both require extra supplies that you might not have at home and that I didn't require you to get. Okay? But I want you to be aware of those type of seam finishes.